Welcome up! In this episode we will talk about capitalism and its ideology. Coming up. Hello, I'm Understanding Politics, and in this channel I explain political theories and debates to students as well as curious and passionate people, just like you. Capitalism is an economic system relying on markets and private means of production for its functioning. An alternative definition is, in fact, free market economy and free enterprise. Capitalism emerged as an alternative to feudalism, a system of production largely relying on agricultural outputs and ownership of the land, where nobles owning lands received a part of the agricultural output by the peasants working said land. The most emblematic breakout of the feudal system is the French Revolution, when the bourgeoisie, a social class of producers living in the cities, decided to get rid of the Ancien Régime, which did not simply consist of an absolute monarchy, but of an outdated system of production. As a system of production, capitalism gave also rise to the study of economy as we know it, because classical economic theory is explaining models referring to early-stage capitalism. As you might know, economics is a social science where there are different theories and models, and while almost all of them use mathematics to justify their rules, these models are in competitions. What do I mean by that? Economics, even the science, is not something objective. There is a clear ideological dimension in the abuse of each economic theory. Do you remember when Marx was explaining that the system of production determines the ideology? Well, it is true just in part, because it is also true that the ideology determines the economic system, and hence the economical theory. How does this happen? Well, many times economical models must rely on assumptions. A huge assumption for a long time was, for instance, that domestic work is not work. If a mother decides to stay home to care for children, her work is not paid by an employer. Based on this, classical economical theory presents this woman as unemployed. On the other hand, feminist scholarship has noted how the employment-gender gap is a symptom of the lack of adequate services by the state. In fact, if there were childcare sponsored by the state, women could go back to their jobs whenever they intended to. And the state would also create more job openings for professional childcare personnel. By the same token, given that societies are sexist, employers often do not offer men the possibility to parent their children by giving them parental leave. This is also another political assumption where women are expected to care for children whilst affecting their employability. This was just a small example, but there are way more assumptions on which classical and neoclassical economical theory rest, hence affecting the economic model and the whole system of production. How should I know then? Well, economical theories must be studied and used as long as they explain an economical phenomenon. On the other hand, they should be problematized whenever they justify and not explain those same economic phenomena. Back to the history of capitalism. Capitalism emerged in the 16th century, but pockets of capitalist societies existed in the Middle Age, such as in Florence during the Renaissance. But we normally think of capitalism associating it with the first industrial revolution in Britain, with the affluence of large amounts of capitals invested in industrial complexes. The difference here is that money is invested in something that will produce potentially more money and profit. This was also ideologically justified by the fact that with the Protestant Reformation, there was an understanding that wealthy people were somehow granted those gifts by God. That's a radical reinterpretation of what Jesus was professing, anyway. Another major factor contributing to this affluence of capital were colonies, because by the 16th century, mercantilism, geographical discoveries, and the enslaving of labor force in the colonies of Africa and America allowed Europeans to enjoy new raw materials for ridiculous costs. Mercantilism turned to industry. These evolutions are closely associated with scientific discoveries and new technology that could mechanize tasks that earlier required more time and efforts to be implemented. The ideology of classical capitalism was expressed in an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, by the Scottish economist and philosopher Adam Smith. Or rather, his study was ideologically used to justify the fact that economic decisions had to be left at the hands of self-regulating market forces. The expression invisible hand of the market, a thing that magically adjusts prices to their optimal state with the encounter of supply and demand, is the perfect example of something that Adam Smith never said or written, but that was gathered as a key takeaway in his book. Later, economic theory will explain a number of cases where the market does not autoregulate, but rather fails. In the 19th century, classic liberalism included free trade, balanced budgets, and minimum levels of poor relief. Working days could be 12 hours, pays were almost non-existent, children were working since the age of 7 or 8 years old, and there were not things such as trade unions or rights of the workers. This was the context criticized by Karl Marx. With World War I, the situation changed as the gold standard was abandoned and trade barriers multiplied. At the same time, the Great Depression showed how the fact that the state was purposefully not intervening in markets created several problems. The Keynesian theories, relying on the idea that the state should use its budget also to create jobs and give relief to unemployed people, was determinant in surpassing the crisis. After World War II, most European states created the so-called welfare state, a system with employment relief, more accessible healthcare, and pensions of retirement. As soon as Western economies grew, though, politicians adopted very liberal economic policies that increased enormously inequalities. We are talking here of the 1980s, especially Reagan and Thatcher. The worst politicians to ever exist, if you ask me. This run for profit is what is causing most of our problems nowadays. In fact, while capitalism assumes that growth is never-ending, resources cannot be exhausted, and everybody can become incredibly wealthy, the truth is quite the opposite. Resources are limited, we are growing demographically, and the environment is dying because we pollute too much. These dimensions of capitalism are what I was referring earlier as justifications rather than explanations of an economic model. Capitalism at these levels is not sustainable in the long term. While it generated incredible levels of growth and technological advances, its abuse will certainly lead to our end. Well, it's nice to end on a positive note, isn't it? The lecture is over. Thank you for watching.